I was sitting at the dinner table, trying to enjoy what should have been a peaceful family meal, when my father's voice thundered through the room. "Your children aren't welcome in this house," he shouted, his eyes wild and unfocused. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, unsure if I had heard him correctly. My sister, Amelia, just smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or one of disbelief, it was almost like she had been expecting this. The smile spread slowly, a knowing curl of her lips. I glanced around the table. My mother looked away, pretending she hadn't heard the outburst, while my younger brother fidgeted with his food, clearly uncomfortable. But Amelia? She seemed eerily calm, like the storm had already passed for her. I had never heard my father speak like this before, especially not to Amelia. She was the one who had always kept him in check, the one who could talk him down from his rages. But not this time. Not tonight. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm. "What do you mean by that?" My father didn't answer right away. He just stared at me with a look I couldn't quite place, anger, disappointment, or maybe something deeper. He looked away, then back at me again, his gaze cold as steel. "You know exactly what I mean," he snapped, his voice low now. "You've brought these kids into my house, and I've had enough. They're not welcome here." Amelia's smile only deepened as she watched the scene unfold. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was off. Something was very off. I tried to process the words. My children? I had no children. What was he talking about? "Are you talking about me?" I asked slowly. My pulse was beginning to race. Amelia's eyes flickered, her smile now almost sinister. "Don't take it personally, it's just things have changed." "What do you mean?" I could feel my hands trembling. This wasn't making sense. None of it was making sense. "You'll understand soon enough," Amelia said cryptically, her tone carrying an air of finality. It was as though she knew something I didn't, a secret that had been buried for far too long. I could feel my heart beating louder in my chest. The atmosphere in the room shifted. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor in a way that made me wince. "Get them out of here, now," he demanded. I stood up too, my mind racing. My sister just continued to smile, her gaze never leaving mine, as though she were watching a play unfold with perfect detachment. My parents were arguing now, their words lost in a blur of noise. But Amelia's smile was all I could focus on, as though it held the key to this entire twisted situation. "Amelia, what's going on?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Her smile never wavered. "I think you know, sister. I think you've always known." And that's when the truth hit me like a freight train. The children weren't mine. They were hers. And my father knew. He'd always known. The house that I had thought was my home wasn't mine at all. It belonged to her, to Amelia. My father's anger wasn't about my so-called children. It was about the fact that I had been living in a lie, in a house that I didn't deserve. A house that had never been mine. And now, finally, the mask had slipped. Amelia's smile faded, replaced by something darker. Something dangerous. I stood there, frozen, as the weight of Amelia's words settled in. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, but I couldn't process it. My mind was scrambling, piecing together fragments of memories that had never quite fit, glances between Amelia and my father, hushed conversations when I was supposed to be asleep, the way my mother always seemed to shrink in the background, too silent to defend herself. Amelia's expression didn't change. She was calm, unnervingly so. I could feel the blood rush to my head as I opened my mouth, trying to form words, but nothing came out. "You've always been too blind to see," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "This family was never really yours, not in the way you thought. The truth has been right here, under your nose all along." I glanced at my father, hoping for some sign of reason, some hint of remorse. But his face was stone, his eyes narrowed with a cold fury I hadn't seen before. "You don't belong here," he repeated, each word like a hammer striking my chest. "And neither do they." I took a shaky step back, almost stumbling over my own feet. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I had always believed that the house, the dinner table, the life I'd built around them was mine. But it wasn't. It never had been. And now it was slipping away faster than I could grasp it. Amelia stood, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape. She walked over to the window, staring out into the darkened yard. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, as though she was watching everything unfold exactly as she had planned. "I knew you wouldn't understand right away," she said without turning to face me. "But you'll get there. Eventually." "What are you talking about?" I shouted, the words bursting from me without thought. "You're my sister. You're my family." She laughed then, but it wasn't the kind of laughter I remembered from our childhood. There was no warmth in it, just a coldness that sent a chill down my spine. "Family? That word has no meaning here anymore. You've been a pawn in a game, and now you've outlived your use." I felt my stomach churn, a deep sense of betrayal curling in my gut. My own sister, my own blood, had been playing some kind of sick game with me all this time. And I had been none the wiser. You knew, didn't you?" I turned to my mother, my voice cracking. She had been the one who always kept the peace, always made sure everything seemed fine. But now, I could see the way she looked at the floor, avoiding my gaze. She didn't respond. She couldn't. A door creaked open in the hallway, and I instinctively turned. A young girl, no older than 5, stepped into the room. Her wide eyes scanned the table, settling on me. "Mom?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Go back to bed," Amelia said softly, but there was no warmth in her tone. The girl hesitated but nodded, turning on her heel and disappearing down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. The child. The one my father had screamed about. She was real. But how? What was she doing here? Who is she? I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Amelia turned back to me, her smile fading into something more intense, more calculating. "She's mine," she said, her voice low and steady. "And she's the reason you're no longer welcome here." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. But somehow, I knew there was no point in arguing anymore. I was too far gone, too deep in whatever twisted story Amelia had been weaving for years. "I should have told you earlier," she continued, her tone almost pitying now. "But you wouldn't have believed me. You never would have seen it." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, stunned, lost, and more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I looked at my father again, but his eyes never met mine. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between us spoke volumes. This was her house now. It always had been. And I was the one who didn't belong. As I stumbled toward the door, my mother's voice came from behind me, faint and broken. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it was too late for apologies. I didn't want them anymore. Not from her. Not from anyone. The door slammed behind me, and I was left standing in the cold night, the echo of Amelia's smile still haunting me in the distance. I stood outside in the cold, the door to the house now locked behind me, a barrier between me and everything I thought I knew. My breath came in ragged gasps, the night air stinging my lungs, but the chill wasn't from the weather. It was from the sudden, suffocating realization that I had been living a lie. For years, I had thought I knew my family. Thought I knew my place in this world. But now, it felt like everything had been flipped upside down. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I could feel my mind spinning, trying to grasp at any shred of logic in what had just happened. What was Amelia's game? Why was my father so cold toward me? Why had my mother stayed silent all these years? My feet moved automatically, carrying me down the driveway. The moon cast long shadows over the ground, making everything look unreal. I thought I might just keep walking, away from everything, away from the lies, but I stopped at the edge of the property. The house loomed behind me, and for the first time, I could see it for what it truly was, a prison. A place where I had been kept in the dark, my reality twisted by the people I trusted most. I was still standing there when the sound of a car engine hummed in the distance. I turned my head, half expecting to see my father's car, but it wasn't him. The headlights of a truck gleamed through the trees, growing brighter as it approached. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but something about it made my stomach twist in unease. The truck pulled up beside me, and the engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a man I had never seen before. His features were sharp, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at me, sizing me up like a predator evaluating its prey. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. I shook my head, feeling an odd sense of unease creep up my spine. "No," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. "I'm not lost." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded as though satisfied. "Good," he said, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You're not the one they expect to be here." The words sent a jolt through me. I felt my chest tighten, panic bubbling up again. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the truck and pulled out a small, weathered box, placing it carefully in the back of his truck. The box looked like it had been through hell, scratched, dented, and stained with what could only be blood. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look away. "You're not supposed to know about that," he said, his tone colder now, like a warning. "But it doesn't matter. Not anymore." "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling like I was losing control. "Who are you? What's going on?" He didn't seem to care about answering. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder toward the house, as though checking to make sure no one was watching. "You'll find out soon enough. But you won't like it." Before I could respond, he climbed back into the truck, slamming the door with a force that made the entire vehicle shudder. "Get out of here," he said, his voice final. "It's not safe for you anymore." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. The feeling of dread was so overwhelming, it seemed to crawl under my skin. Something was wrong, something deeper than I could even comprehend. I didn't want to stay in this place, not anymore. But I didn't know where else to go. The truck engine roared to life, and the man sped off, the tires kicking up gravel as the vehicle disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, motionless, feeling the weight of his words press down on me. I had to leave. But the question that hung over me, that gnawed at me with every step I took away from that house, was the one I couldn't escape. Why did I feel like I was being hunted? The next few days were a blur. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. Something in me knew that if I did, I might never be able to leave again. I stayed in a motel, trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. But it wasn't enough. My thoughts kept drifting back to that box, to the strange man, and to Amelia's smile. There were pieces I wasn't seeing, and the longer I stayed away from that house, the more I realized I was running out of time to figure them out. I didn't know how long I had, but I knew I couldn't keep running. Whatever this was, it was far from over. The motel room felt too small, too suffocating. I spent days there, staring at the cracked ceiling, my mind unraveling with every passing hour. The more I tried to push everything to the back of my mind, the more it crept back in. The man in the truck, the box, the chilling words had said, "It's not safe for you anymore." And Amelia. I could still hear her voice in my head, soft and mocking, as though everything had been a game she'd been playing from the very beginning. I couldn't keep running. Not from the truth. not from the darkness that was closing in around me. I knew I had to go back, had to face whatever it was that awaited me there. But I didn't know what I would find. Would it be my father, still as cold and unfeeling as before? Would Amelia be waiting for me with that same calculating smile? Or would I uncover something far worse, something that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself? It was a decision I'd been avoiding, but I couldn't put it off any longer. I packed my things, each item feeling heavier than the last. The weight of it all, of the lies, of the fear, of the betrayal, pressed down on me, but there was no turning back now. I drove through the empty streets, the city fading behind me like a distant memory. The further I got from the motel, the closer I felt to the house. My stomach churned with a mix of dread and anticipation. What would I find when I walked through that door again? The road seemed endless, and the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon by the time I reached the familiar stretch of trees that lined the driveway. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent, just like it had been when I left. Nothing had changed. Nothing had ever changed. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a broken family anymore. This wasn't about a few angry words or an argument. There was something much darker hidden beneath the surface, something I hadn't been able to see until now. The box. The strange man. The truth about Amelia. I had to know what it all meant. I parked in front of the house, the headlights casting long shadows on the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out of the car. For a moment, I stood there, taking in the house one last time. The quiet seemed deafening. Nothing stirred. No lights. No movement. It felt wrong. I walked up the front steps, each footstep echoing in the night air, the sound heavy in the stillness. When I reached the door, my hand hesitated before knocking. What was I expecting? An apology? An explanation? Or was I just trying to force myself to accept that my entire life had been a lie? I knocked. Once. Twice. No answer. I tried the door handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. With a slow, reluctant push, I stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and stale air clinging to the walls. It was exactly the same as I remembered it, yet it felt so foreign now. So wrong. I called out, my voice breaking the silence, but there was no response. The house was empty, or so it seemed. I walked through the foyer, the worn hardwood floors creaking beneath my feet. The house had an eerie stillness, like it had been abandoned for years, even though I knew that wasn't the case. It was just as it had been when I lived here. But the silence made it feel as though something, or someone, was watching me. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn shut. I moved through the house slowly, every room feeling colder than the last. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the table, was the box. The same weathered, blood-stained box I had seen the man with. It was open now, and my heart skipped a beat. Inside, there was nothing but a single, folded piece of paper. I reached for it, my hands trembling as I unfolded the creased paper. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, like it had been written in a rush. My breath caught in my throat as I read the words, "Asterisk, you're too late." Asterisk, the words sent a shockwave through my body, a deep, guttural fear that had nothing to do with the house itself. It was the fear of what I had missed, what I had failed to see. What Amelia had known all along. I spun around, my pulse racing, as though something was closing in on me. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the darkness thickened around me. And then I heard it. A creak. A shuffle. Someone, or something, moving in the shadows. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the paper, clutching it in my hand, and turned to face the kitchen doorway. There, standing in the shadows, was Amelia. Her eyes glimmered in the dim light, and her smile had returned, though this time it was darker, more knowing. More dangerous. You shouldn't have come back, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. And just like that, I knew. I wasn't going to get the answers I needed. Not from her. Not from anyone in this house. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like I was breathing in something heavy and suffocating. Amelia stood there, her gaze fixed on me with an eerie calmness. Her smile was still there, though it wasn't one of comfort anymore, it was a warning. You've been looking for answers, she said, her voice low and almost tender. But some truths are better left buried. I backed up, my legs unsteady as I moved away from the table, away from the box, which seemed to pulse with a sinister energy now. What do you mean? What have you done? What's in that box? I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Her eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, it almost felt like she was pitying me. You've always been too naive. Always asking the wrong questions. The truth isn't in that box, it's in the blood. The blood that runs through this house. Through all of us. I felt my heart skip a beat. My throat tightened, and I struggled to get the words out. Blood? What the hell are you talking about? Amelia stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. You should have known better than to come back. You were never meant to be part of this family. Not truly. The things we've done, the things I've done, it's not for someone like you. My breath caught in my chest as I took a step back, realizing that whatever she was about to say, it would shatter everything I'd ever believed about who I was. You're lying, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and touched my arm, her fingers cold as ice. The truth is, she said, I've been waiting for you to figure it out. For you to understand. But you're too late. My mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that felt like a nightmare unraveling. No. No. I don't believe you, I gasped, shaking my head, feeling dizzy. Amelia's gaze hardened. You should. Because it's the only truth that matters. You've been part of this game all along, whether you knew it or not. But now you've crossed a line you can't uncross. You've seen too much. Before I could respond, she backed away, and the cold smile returned. You won't leave this place again. Not after what you know. I spun around, panic flooding my chest as I dashed toward the door. I couldn't stay here, couldn't let her get to me. I wasn't ready to die in this place, not like this, not at her hands. I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I felt a sharp, heavy force slam into my back. My vision blurred, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. I collapsed onto the floor, my head spinning. I could hear Amelia's footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. My body was frozen, and I struggled to move, the room spinning around me. The cold, the darkness, it all closed in. The shadows seemed to stretch out, and I felt my thoughts slowing, my body weakening, as if I were being consumed by something I didn't understand. And then, just before everything went black, I heard her voice again. Don't worry. It'll be quick. You'll never have to remember any of this. The final thing I saw before I lost consciousness was Amelia's smile, wide, knowing, triumphant. When I woke up, the world was different. The room was quiet, the air stale, but I wasn't in the kitchen anymore. I was lying in a bed, wrapped in thick, cold sheets. My body ached, my head throbbed. Slowly, I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I reached out for the edge of the bed, my fingers trembling. I wasn't in the house anymore. A light flickered above me, casting long shadows against the walls. The walls were bare, the air sterile, like I was in some kind of hospital room. But there was something off, something wrong. I forced myself to sit up, my breath shallow. I looked around the room, and my stomach twisted as my gaze landed on the window. Outside, the landscape was unfamiliar. The world beyond it was different, no longer the place I had known. I heard footsteps approaching, and before I could react, the door creaked open. Amelia stood in the doorway, her eyes dark, her smile absent. She was wearing a long coat, her expression unreadable. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice hoarse and fragile. "What have you done?" Her gaze flickered toward the window before she spoke. "You'll never remember this place the same way again. But you won't care either. The life you had is gone. You've been removed." Removed. The word echoed in my mind, a final nail in the coffin of my reality. The truth was no longer something I could escape. It was there, in the room with me, in the house that had never been mine. Everything I knew, every connection I had to the world outside of this place, had been erased. Amelia had made sure of that. "You're a part of this now," she said quietly, almost as though she were speaking to herself. "And you always will be." I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. There was no escape from the truth, no way to undo what had been done. My life had been rewritten, and all I could do now was live with it. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone in the silence. And as I lay back in the bed, staring at the ceiling, one thing was painfully clear: I was never going to leave. Not alive. Not sane. The game had ended for me, and there was no way out. Not anymore.